My lady, the first witness today is Miss Amanda Stocks. She appears remotely and she'll be asked questions on behalf of the inquiry by Mr. Lee.
Thank you, Ms. Tobin. Mr. Lee.
My lady, may I please call Ms. Amanda Stocks?
Good morning.
Ms. Stocks, can I check, please, that you can hear me and you can see me?
Yep, I can hear.
Good morning, Miss Stocks. I'm the usher. Can you hear me?
Ms. Stocks appears to have frozen. She's back.
Apologies, the connection froze then a second.
Good morning, Miss Stocks. I'm the usher. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, thank you, yes.
I'm going to take you through the affirmation. If you would like to repeat after me, please. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Stocks. You have provided a witness statement to the inquiry dated the 25th of April 2025. And the reference we have for that is INQ 00652258. Can you confirm, please, that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can.
Ms. Stocks, if we can start, please, with your professional background. You are currently the head teacher of Stirling Inclusion Support Service, which is a school that provides specialist provision for children in Stirling in Scotland. And at the start of the pandemic, you were working at Stirling Inclusion Support Service as a principal teacher. And in August 2021, you became the head teacher. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Do you have any other teaching experience prior to joining that service?
Yes, so I've been a teacher for 23 years. I qualified in 2002 and worked within a mainstream secondary school in England for a period of time. I've held several roles alongside being a teacher, such as a head of year. I've been the Special Educational Needs and Disability Coordinator, an assistant head, and also the designated safeguarding lead before moving up to Scotland.
Ms. Stocks, thank you for that. I now want to move to the type of specialist provision your service provides to children. You explain in your statement that within Stirling, the local authority has 38 primary schools and 7 secondary schools. There are 9 additional support needs specialist provisions, 4 at primary and 5 at secondary, with the majority based in mainstream schools, and 1 standalone specialist school. Please, can you explain the specialist provision that your service provides to children and how this provision of education differed from that provided in a mainstream school?
Yes, so we have 3 bases within Stirling Inclusion Support Service, and those bases are schools for young people with the highest level of need. We support young people and also the families in the widest sense of young people who have additional support needs, particularly relating to social, emotional, and behavioural difficulties. We also have an outreach leg within the service as well, so we do support all the nurseries and schools, both primary and secondary across the Stirling local authority. But for those young people with the highest levels of need, we do provide base support, provision support for those young people.
Ms. Stocks, you say that the service works with families. In what way do you work with families?
So we look after young people and the families holistically, and we have a dedicated family support worker, and so the families are an integral part of the work that we do with our young people.
How many children, both at primary and secondary, were attending your service at the start of 2020?
So we have capacity for up to 10 young people, 10 children at primary and 18 at secondary. The statement that I provided related to the primary young people, and we had 9 at that point during the start of the pandemic.
Ms Stocks, you've already referred to the children who attend your service as having the highest level of need. Can you explain, please, how the characteristics and backgrounds of the children who attend your service differ from those characteristics of children who attended mainstream schools?
I would say that all our young people have additional support needs, as there are many young people in mainstream schools that have additional support needs. But through assessment and through discussions with a team around a child and liaison with other professionals, a decision is made with regards to whether a young person needs more intensive levels of support. So children that attend Stirling Inclusion Support Service do not necessarily need a formal diagnosis. We work on presenting behaviours and we have young people with various diagnoses and some with none whatsoever. So we can work with young people that have autism, for example, fetal alcohol syndrome. We work with young people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder as well, but it's not a requirement for the support at Stirling Inclusion Support Service.
And how would a child enter your service? Would that be by way of a referral?
So there's 2 ways of entry. It could be by a placing request that a parent or carer that would put in as a request for the service. Quite often we work with young people on an outreach capacity, and the team around the child and the parents and the carers are integral to that team, may consider that more support is required than can be provided in a mainstream school. At that point, assessment, reports, minutes of meeting are put into the GERFEC resource group, where there are professionals that sit on that panel, and then a decision is made and a recommendation is made whether a provision placement would be appropriate. Parents and carers then have the ability to accept that or not.
And Ms Stocks, you say in your statement that 75% of primary children prior to the pandemic were care experienced, and you define that as someone who has been or is currently in care or who is looked after at any stage of their life. Would it be right, therefore, that the children who attended your service would receive some form of social care support?
Yes, a vast proportion of them, and you can see from our witness statement that we have a significantly higher than average of young people within our service that are children who have experienced care.
Would that mean, therefore, that these children would have suffered in the past previous disruptions to their education?
It is quite likely, yes.
And Ms Stocks, at paragraph 7.1 of your statement, you refer, when talking about the children, that many have additional vulnerabilities as they are care experienced. Is there anything you want to add to that?
I think it can be very individual to the young people as to what the vulnerability is. It can take many different forms. Obviously, social work have a way of identifying the different types of trauma that young people have suffered. It could be that some have endured poverty, and poverty in the widest sense. It might be rural or working poverty as well. It could be medical trauma that they've suffered from, or it could be family circumstances which meant that they've suffered vulnerability and trauma.
And Ms Stocks, you've made reference to those additional vulnerabilities in your evidence today, and you explain in your statement that prior to the pandemic, staff members would visit homes to build relationships. Why is that so important?
All the work that we do, we're very proud to be trauma-informed, and all the work that we do is based on nurture and relationships. We work therapeutically, and quite often we work with the people who have the best relationships with people, and we want to broaden that therapeutic web. And so we would use existing positive relationships to transfer onto new relationships. We want our young people to be safe in their environments and secure in their relationships. So we meet young people people where they're at, and that can involve working at different locations where they're community-based and sometimes home-based as well. So it's about getting it right on an individual basis for our children and young people.
Ms Stocks, finally, just before we move on to March 2020, you've just told the inquiry how you work. Can I ask, please, can you provide a high-level overview of what the delivery of a bespoke programme looked like in practice?
Yeah, so that's quite difficult to answer in a succinct and high-level approach because it can look different based on the individual needs of the young people. We take into account their interests, their needs, what it means for them to be safe, and so we work very differently. We might use a lot of experiential learning, like the use of the farm and animal therapy. We might look at music or art. We use quite a lot of sport in order to engage and provide therapeutic support for young people. It is hard to explain on a high level because it's dependent on need and assessment and meeting young people where they are at and how we can move them forward.
Ms Stocks, if we can now move, please, to March 2020. You explain in your statement that during these school closures from the 23rd of March 2020, the primary bases at Stirling Inclusion Support Services were not open to children. And you go on to explain that the local authority had opened hubs for children of essential workers and those children that are deemed vulnerable. Did your pupils attend the local authority hubs?
There was a proportion of our young people that did attend the authority hubs. It looked slightly different for some of our young people because we used existing staff and existing relationships within those hubs. So the hubs was a venue, the work and the relationships were consistent, which was absolutely vital for our young people. And it was based on need. We very quickly established new ways of working with parents and carers, and also we listened intently to what they said, and based on the need, then there were some young people that worked in hub. I think it's probably quite important to think about the context around March 2020 and the public messaging that was very definite and very definitive about staying at home. And our parents and carers were very keen to follow public advice. And there was a level of anxiety and uncertainty expressed by parents and carers and young people around this time. So it was in discussion with themselves, within the wider team around the child, as well as to what would be the most appropriate setting for their learning.
And Ms Stocks, you may have already provided the answer, but my next question was going to be for those children that didn't attend the hubs, can you help us as to why, given they would have fallen within the definition of being vulnerable?
Yes, so it was very much dependent on need and the individual context of our children and their families or the care placements as well. So learning was always provided, but that would have been provided either remotely, either by visits, doorstep visits, garden visits, learning packages. And so it was very much taking a lead from the team around the child as to what was the most appropriate environment for that learning to take place in.
Ms Stocks, I'm going to come on to online learning soon, but can I just check that I've got it right then? So from March 2020, following school closures from the 23rd of March 2020, some children attended the local authority hubs and some children stayed at home and were supported in a different way.
Yes, that's correct.
You explain in your witness statement that bespoke programmes were adapted to try and maximise attendance and engagement. Can you help us with what was happening with attendance and engagement during the pandemic that resulted in you having to make those adaptations?
Yes, so initially we moved on to the use of Google Meet and did remote learning virtual like I'm doing here today. That, I think young people engaged in that initially because there was a novelty about this. It was all kind of new and exciting. Formalised processes had to be put in place, and we quickly then moved on to Google Classrooms alongside physical resources being provided and dropped off at the homes. We saw after often that novelty kind of wore off a little bit, we saw it became slightly more difficult for our young people to engage in that remote learning. So it happened in many different ways, via telephone calls, via Google Classrooms, via learning packs, and there was obviously there was the visits as well by inclusion support workers and the wider team, and that's what happened on a remote basis. Obviously there was direct teaching in the hub, so it looked different for every individual. I think as the first lockdown ensued as well, we had prioritised literacy, numeracy, health and well-being for our young people. But it was supplemented and made bespoke based on their individual interests. So there was interdisciplinary learning as well, and other subject areas if that was an area of interest as well. But it looked different for every individual. But I think as the lockdown wore on, it became more and more difficult to sustain that engagement in remote learning, and it was that. That it was the sort of like the definite physical interactions that young people were missing with staff members, which led us on to a different approach in the second lockdown.
And again, Ms Stocks, we're going to come briefly, if time permits, to the second lockdown. It's clear from your statement that at March 2020, all children had been provided with or given access to a Chromebook or an iPad at the start of the pandemic. Can you help us at why you provided that in March 2020 as opposed to later on in the pandemic?
It would still be available later on in the pandemic as well. But prior to lockdown and the school closure in March 2020, we actually completed an audit for our children, our families and for staff as well. We responded really proactively and really quickly to the news that this may be happening, and so that we were able to ensure that all our young people had access to a device and to internet connection as well. The local authority provided MiFi devices, and so as part of the audit we were able to determine who needed which equipment in order to sustain learning.
Ms Stocks, if we can now turn to maintaining relationships, you've set out to the inquiry why it was so important to maintain relationships. Can you set out any headline challenges you faced during the pandemic to maintain those relationships?
I actually think our relationship strengthened during the pandemic with our families. We have always had very close relationships. We have small numbers of young people and families that we work with, and so that does mean that we're able to establish really good positive working relationships, quite close with them as well. Immediately there'd been lots of conversations prior to the lockdown about what it would look like, what communication would look like. Telephone calls happened from the very first day. Very quickly we moved to doorstep visits as well, in the delivery of free schools meals on a twice weekly basis. So there was several different methods. The one challenge that we overcame quite quickly actually was the use of virtual meetings. We'd never performed virtual team around the child meetings before that point, but by April 2020 every family within the service had a virtual meeting, and the infrastructure that brought about was challenging at points, but quickly overcame. We were able to provide one-to-one support for families so that they knew how to use Teams, so they could get online, so they could have those conversations. Our parents and carers told us that at points they felt quite isolated, and at some points from society, they felt quite isolated, and actually we were the main point of contact, and parents and carers reported strengthened relationships with the school. It became wider conversations than you would have, rather than just about what was going on and the education, the schooling. There was lots of conversations about what was happening during the day, what they were eating for the dinner and the tea, and things like that as well. So relationships really strengthened, and parents and carers report that to us. And I think we have really good open relationships with our parents and carers, but some were, because the relationships had improved even further, they're even more transparent, and that allowed us to provide additional support if and when it was needed.
And Ms Stocks, you've mentioned having daily phone calls with parents and carers, and you've outlined their concerns. What were the children saying? Was anything being fed back to you as to how they were coping with the pandemic and not coming to the service, or not learning in the usual way?
And it was a mixed bag, as you can imagine. Some young people, the novelty value of not attending school for a point was something that they enjoyed. Other young people reported that they felt boredom at times, that they felt isolated. They weren't going out and playing with their peers in the community like they would be able to previously. There was a much more focus for young people on being online and gaming, and the challenges that brought within the family home. So we had frequent communication with our children alongside the parents and carers as well, and they were always really open and honest. They did talk about anxiety throughout the course of the pandemic, and how that was impacting on them individually as well.
Ms Stocks, just on the topic of children spending more time online, you say at paragraph 13.1 of your witness statement that parents and carers reported that their children were accessing inappropriate material online or accessing inappropriate games. How did you respond to that?
Yeah, some parents and carers reported that. They reported that they were online for more than they would like them to be. And they reported that they'd purchased things online that brought financial difficulties within the family, or that they were playing games that the parents and carers wouldn't necessarily want them to play. We appointed a digital lead, or we nominated somebody as a digital lead throughout the course of the pandemic, who was able to remotely support families and children and young people with parental locks, with advice. We were able to signpost them to websites like CEOP and other things like that as well. So we ran sort of like one-to-one sessions for our parents and carers in order to support them in that way. And that's a feature that's continued now into the service. And as a result of the pandemic, we have appointed a digital lead since that point.
And we know, Ms Stocks, that in March 2020, at schools shut, you've told the inquiry that some children stayed at home, some children were attending the hubs. And you've outlined in relation to the effectiveness of online learning for the children at your service that engagement was good, but then it wasn't great after initial success. From April to January 2021, when the second school closures were implemented, what overall impact was the closure of your service having on the children that were staying at home?
I think when we returned to school in August, I think there was an impact in that young people had to be transitioned in differently than there would be at the start of a normal term. For some young people, they were displaying anxiety around the virus, around cleaning, around what was safe, around being around people again. So bespoke transition programmes had to be put in place for individual young people. In January 2021, we remained open, albeit on shorter hours, and I think that was the right move moving forward. I think going back in relation to your question as well, we noticed some young people whose behaviours had changed, the profiles had changed differently, the behaviours that they were displaying changed. They spoke about uncertainty. Some naturally seek out a high five or a hug, physical contact. They weren't necessarily sure whether that was okay or not. Primary young people found social distancing really hard as well, so there was confusion and uncertainty around that. And in terms of the learning, we noticed that our young people different approaches had to be taken, and some required a more play-based curriculum than they previously had experienced.
Ms Stocks, you've mentioned social distancing, so I want to turn to that issue now. You have set out in your statement that, as you've just outlined, when children return to school, infection prevention controls were introduced to limit the spread of COVID-19. Can I ask, therefore, that in your opinion, how practical and realistic was it to implement infection prevention and control methods amongst your pupils, for example, social distancing, one-way systems, or the wearing of face coverings?
Our whole processes had to change. I have to say we were really well supported by the local authority in terms of PPE and guidance and risk assessments, which we could adapt. If we required help or support, we were able to speak to somebody and get guidance, help and support around all of that. Being in quite small settings, one-way systems and things like that weren't necessarily required like they would be in a large mainstream school as well. We could manage movement on corridors, but we did carefully have to work at that to manage who was working with who, minimal contacts for staff members. Our service created bubbles, so there was dedicated staff teams for individuals. We tried to minimise the amount of staff working with the number of young people that there were. We had risk assessments and signage on display. We had processes in terms of cleaning and individual resource boxes that took place after individual sessions and working with young people. It does seem quite surreal now thinking about how school operates, that's how it did operate at that point then. But you can imagine that primary aged children find social distancing very, very, very difficult, and did quite often come into staff space as well, and it was anxiety provoking for people that happened, but there was also recognition of young people with additional support needs, and that also happens as well. So the young people, the staff team, and also the parents and carers were really resilient in this and worked through that process. But there were difficulties at time with all that. Another issue was ventilation as well. And so ventilation had to be in place at all times as well. It meant that heating was on and windows were open during the winter. And additional clothing was provided for schools, and we had to be really creative and to making sure that all those conditions were met each and every day.
And Ms Stocks, finally from me, you say in your statement that the full closure of schools for children with additional support needs is not an option. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Yes, I have to say our local authority invests in Stirling Inclusion Support Service and invests in us as a trauma-informed organisation. And trauma-informed is not and should not be a moniker that is used by establishments and authorities. It is something that should be embedded and that permeates throughout policy and practice throughout. That involves highly skilled staff who nurture the young people, who provide challenge for the young people. And it answers the question for me of whether teachers will be in existence going into the future. We cannot be replaced by robots. That nurture, that relationship is absolutely vital for all learning, and therefore the face-to-face element, direct teaching of young people, especially with additional support needs, is absolutely vital moving forward. They need the predictability of relationships, of routines, of structures. Yes, it might be with mitigations and changes, but that is absolutely vital, and that needs to be embedded. And if any lesson for me is learnt after the pandemic, it's about the importance of trauma-informed practice, of nurture, the importance of relationships to support our young people.
Ms Stocks, those are all my questions. My lady, do you have any questions?
Ms Stocks, you obviously did an excellent job in Stirling supporting the children you care for and their families. Was this a particular Stirling initiative, or was this something that you were aware was spread around Scotland in other areas? Or are you just an exemplar
I think I'm an exemplar. I couldn't answer that question truthfully and honestly. I think everybody had different approaches. I think in Stirling we are a very tight authority who works really closely together, and support's always available. And I feel very fortunate for my service to be allowing the work that we do within our service as well. And that was in place pre-COVID, during COVID, and absolutely after COVID as well.
Well, thank you very much for all you did. I'm sure the families and the children and young people were extraordinarily grateful for what you and your colleagues did to help and support them.
Thank you.
Obviously, you showed great creativity and flexibility.
Thank you. Can I say thank you as well for giving young people and the families with additional support needs a voice in this forum? That's really important that they are heard.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Ms Stocks. Very grateful. Ms Dobbin, I gather we don't need to break anymore.
That's as I understand it too. The next witness is Mr. Lyndon Lewis.
We've still got the link to Ms Stocks online.
My lady, can I just check that you can see Mr. Lewis?
Can now.
You can. Excellent.
If you'd like to repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Mr Lewis.
Mr. Lewis, can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Lyndon William Lewis.
Now, Mr. Lewis, you should have a statement in front of you that bears the number INQ 000 649 886.
Yes.
Do you see that? And are you content that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Lewis, I think it's right that you are the head teacher of Escol Hendrefellen. Is that correct?
That's correct.
I hope that I did the pronunciation
Very
justice.
good. Very good.
Now, you've been the head teacher of that school since 2019. Is that right?
That's correct.
But I think that you are a teacher of some 36 years' experience. Is that right?
Yeah, about that. Yeah, no, it is that. Yeah.
Now, can you just explain, please, a bit about your school? I think it's right that it's a special educational needs school. Is that correct?
Yes, so it's a school that serves the borough of Neath and Talbot, and all of our children at school have additional learning needs. Do you want me to talk about the variety of needs?
Yes, that would be really helpful.
So we have a unit with children with autism. We have another unit, and the children with autism, that's at Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. So that's from 11 years old to 16 years old. We have a Key Stage 3 unit with children with moderate learning difficulties. That's from ages 11 to 14. And we have a moderate learning difficulties unit with Key Stage 4 pupils. That's ages 14 to 16. Then we have a unit which is a primary aged unit for children with social, emotional and behaviour difficulties. We have another unit on another site which is a Key Stage 3 unit with children with social, emotional and behaviour difficulties. Again, that's age 11 to 14. And we have a further site with children with social, emotional behaviour difficulties from the ages of 14 to 16, based in Port Talbot.
And I think it's right, Mr. Lewis, that the children in your school then range from the age of 3 up to 16. Is that correct?
Yeah, we don't currently have any children our sort of 3, 4, 5. However, we can cater for that age group.
And can you recall whether during the pandemic you had children who were that young, or were the children a bit older?
The children were a bit older, from 8 onwards.
8 onwards. And I think it's right that across all of your sites you've got about 177 children.
That's correct.
Correct. And about 102 members of staff.
That's correct.
And I think almost all of your children have a special educational needs plan or an individual plan. Is that?
That's correct.
That's right. And a number of your children, say roughly about 28, are either looked after by the local authority or in receipt of social care services.
That's correct.
All right, I'm just going to turn then, if I may, to the pandemic. Can you remember how far in advance of the 18th of March 2020 you were aware that schools might close?
I suppose there were things on the news around at that time. We had several meetings with local authority discussing the possibility of schools closing. I think the day, or I think maybe 2 days before, we were actually told that we are actually going to close.
Yes.
Yeah, so there was lots of rumours, as they say, and lots of things on social media, etc. But we weren't officially told until a couple of days before.
All right. And the meetings that you had with the local authority, can you remember now how far in advance of the 18th of March they were?
No, I'd say it was weeks.
Yes. And in that period of time, had you been able to start planning then for the prospect that you might have to pivot how you were going to provide education to children, or that prepare for some of them being at home?
Yeah, I suppose it was maybe sort of 5 days in which we were sitting down as a senior group and thinking, actually, it looks like schools may close and we may close. So we started putting plans together then for that, and that was days before we closed.
Yes.
Sorry,
I didn't mean to
Sorry.
cross you. And that realisation, or that meeting that you had 5 days beforehand, do you recall whether that was a result of something you were told, or was that just a realisation that you came to as a school leader?
I think we were looking at all eventualities, and so worst case scenario is that schools would close. So we sort of brainstormed, right, how are we going to deal with this, and how are we still going to educate our children, and what can we do to keep them safe? So so that we started days before, and how we could teach children when they weren't in school, really. So that's where we started, and we put some training in before we left, which were in the last 2 days when we were told you're going to close. Then we had some training into how to use Google Classrooms and Teams, which I suppose is everybody knows and understands what those things are now. But it was back when we didn't. Then it was a massive change for our staff. So we spent. I know it sounds a bit strange, but I met somebody, and it took 3 of our staff to meet somebody at a service station on the M4 who sat there and showed us exactly how to use Google Classrooms and how we could teach others to use it. And then we went back to school, and I freed up those 3 staff to work with each one of our teaching staff over the next 2 days to show them how to do it. And we started to work a little bit with children and how to use it. But it was, that was the last 2 days before we actually knew that we were closing.
So after the announcement was made on the 18th of March, did your site stay open in order to allow children to come into school?
Yes, so we were open for vulnerable pupils to attend. So we closed for a short while, and then we opened for vulnerable children to attend school.
All right. So are you able to remember now the proportions of children who came into school as opposed to the children who stayed at home?
So initially, we're talking probably less than 10% of the children initially.
In which...
Who were in school.
Right.
Right at the start. Those numbers grew as time went on.
And do you remember, if we just focus on the first set of school closures for the moment, can you remember now the most number of children you were able to get to come into school during that period?
So we're talking of numbers like sort of 15 children.
Yes.
Social distancing. Those sorts of numbers at the start.
So the reality was most of your children then were at home, is that right?
Yes.
And did those children have access to devices in order to be able to make use of the training that your staff had been able to get in the few days?
Initially, no. Early days. But like I say, as time wore on, more children came into school.
Yes.
So we had lots of other classes coming in and numbers on rotation because of social distancing measures, etc. So we had maybe over the week that all of the class would be in for half of the week.
Right.
And the other half of the class would be in for the other half of the week. Right. Just down to pure space and numbers.
So was that during the first period of school closures, or was that later on?
That was later on.
All right.
That was
And did the children in your school, did they start to get devices?
We had devices from the local authority, and so we were able in time to get devices to every child so that everybody had a device at home that they could work from.
And did that take a while, or did that happen quite quickly?
It happened fairly quickly.
And then once children got those devices, what was the engagement with online provision from the school like?
The engagement for, I would say, our children with autism and our children with moderate learning difficulties, then the engagement was really high. On some mornings it would be 100%, but it would always be high, sort of 80% engagement plus. The same with our children from moderate learning difficulties. With moderate learning difficulties, there was less engagement from children with social, emotional, and behaviour difficulties. I think that was the group of young people who were most challenging to get to engage in education remotely.
And was the school able to do anything for those children to try and help them whilst they were at home?
We some would engage online, some wouldn't. Some preferred to work with pen and paper and work packs. So as a school, we delivered work packs, we delivered laptops, we had dongles from the local authority for those children who could not access the internet. So and we visited houses as staff. We took children for walks. We sort of we had a job of educating them, obviously, but we also felt we had a job of sort of looking after their well-being as best as we could and their anxiety over those times. So for some, a walk, a social distance walk along the seaside was better than sitting down and doing some maths. You know, so it was horses for courses, as they say.
Let me ask you a bit more about what your staff were doing then to when they were visiting homes. What kind of support were they offering?
From, like I say, really from sort of well-being walks and talks. We'd to working one-on-one with children with maths and English and other subjects. So it was a variety of ways of working with children at home. We had some children who would not come out of their bedrooms, and their parents couldn't get them out of their bedrooms because they were so scared. So we have some specialist staff who have particular sort of relationships with some of our most challenging youngsters, and they were able to coax them to come out and talk with them and get them to sit in the garden and, you know, talk to them about the pandemic and the family and these sorts of things. Anything really to improve their well-being and to reassure them and lower their rates of anxiety, etc. So it was, you know, vast number of things depending on what we all felt was needed for those particular youngsters. So as a senior team, so those children who were at home and receiving work, then we would have our middle leaders would meet with our staff who were out and about. We'd have all this to feed into a well-being group, which we would meet then twice a week and discuss every single pupil that we have in school and go through that they've seen, you know, seen the parents, we've made calls, they're attending, they're engaging, or there's a problem with such and such family, right, we need to get out of there today. So it was just making sure that we covered everybody. And safeguarding was a massive sort of focus during this time, safeguarding and well-being. And I suppose they overtook, at many times, they overtook the delivery of actual sort of education as such.
Can I just...
Yeah, sorry, I'll
No,
go back quiet again.
I'm sorry, Ms. Lewis. I just wanted to ask you about the broader support that your school offered, which I think you mentioned in your statement, that staff weren't just going out to provide education, but I think you mentioned food delivery as well. Is that right?
Yes, we had staff delivering food and food parcels to different families and families who were struggling. We had, you know, there was occasions, and I can remember an occasion where a family, the family who, where they all had, the whole of the family had COVID, and they didn't have any food in the house. And so they, at the time, social services weren't available to go out and help, and health weren't able to go into the house because everybody in the family had COVID. So the school staff went, because we're in touch with them each day, then they would ring us and say, oh, look, Johnny's now got it, and so we can't get out to shop or anything. So staff would, I can remember going out, and my deputy and his wife going shopping for some of the family and then delivering it to the house. And that was sort of common during different parts of COVID.
So not part of their school.
Not quite
duties.
what we did our degree for, but I think there was like a community spirit, and because our classes in school are small classes, so the sort of communication between parents and teachers and teaching assistants is often on a daily basis, and during COVID it was on a daily basis. And if our staff, if they were working remotely or if they were in school, if there was somebody who didn't turn up to a remote session online, then the staff would then ring and make sure they had that the family was safe and that the children were safe. So that became part of our daily routine.
I wanted to pick up on something else you mentioned in your statement, which I think is that, and I'm just going to summarise this, Mr. Lewis, that in terms of the support children got at home, that was quite dependent on family circumstance as well. Is that correct?
Yes, I think there's a sort of an assumption that everybody's capable of doing it, and we just found that that lots of families need support, and children need support, and we can't assume that in every house there's going to be a laptop with Wi-Fi, there's going to be pens, there's going to be paper, and there's going to be adults who are able to support the children educationally. We have some of our adults, some of our parents came to our school many years ago. We have some parents who were unable to read, and so we had to be really careful when we were communicating with parents. It's okay to say, we go onto the school website or send a letter home. For many parents, not many, for some parents, that wasn't the best means of communication. So for those, we would sometimes, if need be, go round to the house to be able to explain in person to make sure that they understood why certain measures were being taken, and also how they can support their children. And I suppose at times you realise that for many of them it's really difficult to support their children educationally.
Yes.
And I think that's important for us all to know then, really, in case something like this happens again.
It's one of your recommendations, is it? I think, on one of the points that you make, that no one should assume anything about what's available in the home.
That's right.
In order to be able to support children, particularly educationally.
Yes.
During a pandemic.
Yeah.
May I ask you, Mr. Lewis, whether you think, in relation to the children in your school, the pandemic has had any enduring impacts on them?
I think we're still seeing the effects of the pandemic, particularly on literacy in school. I would say for a couple of years after, you still talk about anxiety levels, but we see gaps in knowledge of children and gaps in skills. I remember our staff coming to see, our middle leaders coming to see me because the children's reading skills, we were having more children arriving at school who couldn't read and couldn't read at all. So we went to train all of our staff on different methods of teaching reading and reading with children individually to improve their reading skills. And we're still seeing that now.
Yes.
We're still seeing the effects of it now. So, we continue to train any new staff who come in, and it's something which we monitor regularly because it's so important for the future of all of the children, isn't it? Yes. They need these basic skills.
And have you found those interventions, are they starting to work and help children to...
Yeah, the interventions have been working since we've started them, which was shortly after the pandemic. And we do employ some staff who just focus working one-on-one with children with these interventions. And we continue to do it. And there is a need to continue to do it.
I'm just going to go back, if I may, Mr. Lewis, to one of your recommendations. And this is at paragraph 57 of your statement, where you suggest, I think that it would have been helpful for you to have had more input from health practitioners and child psychologists, or maybe a bit more access to that sort of support that might have been able to help you.
Yeah, I suppose it's on reflection, isn't it? When we're asking about what have we learnt if this ever happened again, what could improve things for youngsters. And one of the things that we identified was obviously if we could train parents, provide more sort of training for parents, more online resources for parents, workshops, these sorts of things, but also to include health practitioners and child psychologists into this, producing sort of educational videos, which would help for a better understanding maybe for some of the youngsters and some of the parents during the pandemic of what was going on.
It sounds as though one of the most important resources that was available to you, Mr. Lewis, throughout this period was your staff. Do you, upon reflection, think that you had a particularly cohesive and close group of staff who were in a position to support the children in your school?
Yeah, I'd say that I was very lucky, and we were very lucky as a school to have such a sort of committed staff and a caring staff. And you can only speak about your own experience, can't you, in your own school? And our staff were fabulous during this time, going sort of above and beyond. Yeah, going above and beyond on a daily basis, really, to support families, and of which, at times it was quite scary yourself, isn't it? When some of the things, I think one of the things you've got to realise when you work with children with additional learning needs is that I know we've got rules for social distancing and wearing masks, etc. But our children very often don't understand those. So they weren't able to social distance. A lot weren't able to wear masks. They weren't able to test themselves. And sometimes the parents aren't able to test them. So we had to test them in school. And, before you know it, you would turn and somebody would be standing and coughing over you, not because they mean to cough on you, it's because they don't understand how the rules worked. And I think during those times, there was sort of unwavering support then from the staff in school who came in no matter what. And and did their job and did over and above their job. And it comes down to people, doesn't it? I think it comes down to people, no matter where you are and whether they care about their job and their role. And I was lucky to have a staff who really cared.
Mr. Lewis, those are all my questions. My lady, do you have any questions for Mr. Lewis?
Mr. Lewis, you've explained how you and your staff coach, and I'm sure your staff would say they were very lucky to have you as a leader too. You obviously all did a huge amount to look after the children and young people in your care. Did you get any support from outside? In other words, you just talked about having educational videos and things, but at the time during the pandemic, was there stuff coming from on high to say if you did this would help, or did you have to think about it all yourselves?
I'd say we thought of lots of it ourselves. We could ring people. So there was support out there. But as you know, most people were working from home, so there wasn't any support as such in school, and particularly in the early days. Then, we had to find a way forward, but we obviously had to check all the time that a way forward could be done, and to make sure that we did it in a safe way and we didn't break any of the rules that were about at the time. So I suppose there was support on hand to dial on a telephone.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Mr. Lewis, for coming to help the inquiry and for all that you and your staff did during the pandemic. I'm sure that all your local community are extremely grateful to you all. It was such an important job you did, and I hope it was obviously tough to go back talking about those times, and I hope we haven't caused you too much distress, but thank you for everything you've done.
Okay, thanks.
My lady, the next witness is Mr. Paul Marks, and he'll be examined on behalf of the inquiry by Miss Traynor.
Thank you, Ms. Traynor.
Thank you, my lady. May I call Mr. Marks?
If you just repeat after me. I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you.
Thank you for attending today, Mr. Marks, and for providing your witness statement, which is dated the 4th of June 2025, and which we have at INQ 000 587 852. And I think you should have that in front of you. Can you confirm that the contents of that statement are true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm it's true.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Marks, you are the principal of the high school Ballynahinch, and you've been invited to give evidence today because during the pandemic, your school was one of a number in Northern Ireland which operated as a hub for vulnerable children and the children of essential workers. Is that right?
That's correct.
And if I may summarise what you've said in your statement, by way of brief introduction, your school is a post-primary school. It's a non-selective school with 415 pupils.
That's correct.
About right. You've said that you have a free school meal eligibility of around 35%, which I think is typical for a non-selective post-primary.
It would be, yes.
And you also said that you have an autism special needs provision with a student population of around 70. Have I got that right?
That's correct.
And in your statement, you mention your involvement in a network of school principals in Northern Ireland who were sharing their experiences and advice throughout the pandemic. And I'd like to just ask you at the outset, to what extent do you think that your views on the impacts and challenges faced by schools like yours during the pandemic will be reflective of the experiences of other secondary schools in Northern Ireland?
I would like to think it would be very similar. There will be small differences, probably in terms of size and in terms of the different types of schools there are in Northern Ireland. But I would like to think we would all have a similar, but with small differences, experiences throughout the pandemic of both lockdowns and between.
That's helpful. Thank you, Mr. Marks. And turning then to the pandemic, do you remember when you first became aware that schools might close?
So I think the first mention was that we had received communication in early March about travelling abroad, specifically to Italy. And then we realised as a school things are going to have a significant impact on our children. We probably did not really envisage shutting down schools, and we were assured that that wouldn't happen in early March. However, we started to make some initial plans in terms of getting access to teachers, an area on cloud storage for children to access resources. But we were not ready for a school closure in terms of effective teaching and learning.
Okay, and a quick point of clarification just on that. Prior to 2020, would your school have received any guidance or information from the Department of Education or the Education Authority about school closures in the event of an emergency, like a pandemic?
Not to my knowledge, no, not our memory.
Now, we know that on the 20th of March 2020, most schools in Northern Ireland closed to most pupils, and some schools like yours, as we've said, remained open. Can you give us a sense of how many children would have been attending in that initial period of school closures at Ballynahinch?
So we only had 2 children attend, and I think we tried our best to give as much information to parents as possible. I think that whenever I spoke to other principals at that time, we had no doubt what an essential worker was, because it was clearly laid out to us from DE and from the Education Authority. So I think the message that went to parents was one of, and I'll have to be honest here, even though we didn't say it, I think the word NHS came up quite a lot with my parents, because when some parents spoke to me, they said, but we don't work in the NHS. And I tried to explain, yes, but there are essential workers who are not just NHS workers. But they said, no, we don't want to burden the school. We're going to keep our kids at home. We're going to sort childcare out. We're going to look after them ourselves. So I think there was almost like an almost perception among parents that only those who worked in hospitals really should be sending their children in. I was worried because we only having 2 children in the school seemed, a very a small number in terms of, how can we justify this, and are we doing this right? Is there something more we could do? But then you were receiving weekly emails about the number of pupils in schools in Northern Ireland, and I think it was something like 400 schools open and only 700 children going. So that averages less than 2 children going to school in Northern Ireland during that time. So I felt that we were doing the same as everybody else. So it was okay. Yeah.
Thank you. And you've mentioned there that there was, I suppose it was clear to you who the essential workers were, albeit it may not have been clear to parents. In relation to vulnerable children, we see that in April 2020, the Department of Education published guidance which explained that children who had a statement of special educational needs, children who were receiving support from health and social services, and children in other difficult family circumstances were included in that definition. I think you're familiar with that guidance.
Yes.
And in that intervening period between schools closing on the 20th of March and that guidance coming on the 10th of April, was that judgment about which children were vulnerable? How did you go about making that judgment in your school?
Well, just to give you a bit of background there, on the 8th of April, the Minister wrote to principals, and it was part of an annex to that email which listed those kids in terms of a pure definition of being vulnerable. Now, if you were to ask me how many vulnerable children I had in my school, I could probably name them, and probably less than 10. But the definition of a vulnerable child set out on the 8th of April to me would mean a huge number of pupils who would be eligible to come into school. So for those 2 days before the guidance actually came out and was made public, for those 2 days, I had to plan for a large number of pupils coming in. And I felt that what we had in place in the school for the children that I had there was effective, and I wasn't sure how I was going to manage having a very large number of pupils come in. But we sent the information to the parents, yet no parents came back to me. Now, when speaking with parents, there was a sense to me that they still didn't want to burden the school, or there was a fear of sending their children in because then they would be mixing with other children and bring back COVID. Or there was also a fear of, we're doing okay and we don't want to admit we're under pressure. There were a few families I contacted directly and offered them to come in because I thought they would be struggling from knowledge of them. And they were happy enough, and I had no concerns at that time for them to come in. So we had the door open for them, and we had no further children want to come in.
Okay. Now, in that answer, Mr. Marks, you said that at that time you had no concern, and without inviting you to disclose any personal information, is the suggestion there that may have changed as time went on?
In the second lockdown, I had serious concerns. Yes.
Okay.
And I was effective in terms of bringing more children in.
Because of those concerns?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, in practical terms then, can you tell us a bit about the provision that your school made for children who were attending and what that looked like on the ground?
So we basically had 2 separate rooms for each child, and we had 2 separate staff. And in the middle of all of this, we were getting water pumps changed. We had an infestation of mice. So we managed it as best we could between 3 staff. I felt that, I was asking a lot of the 3 of us to do what we were doing. But it worked well. We had no canteen facilities, so we had to make the children breakfast and lunch. There was no transport for the children either. They had applied for transport back in March and they were told no. So the parents were leaving earlier, dropping kids off and then going to do their shifts and then coming back and picking the children up. So our timings, we had to be flexible with the parents. So it was a joint effort. We had no PPE at that time either. So we borrowed goggles from the technology department, masks that you would normally use in woodwork, and science, and basically bought as much alcohol gel as we could, and we tried our best. So we were cleaners as well to try and ensure as best we could, but we weren't experts. We didn't really know what we were doing. We were hoping for the best, and that's what we did. And I think every school that was in that position probably did the same. I don't think we were in any way outliers in that regard.
Thank you. And in the course of that answer, Mr. Marks, you said that some children had applied for transport and were told no. Can you help us understand what the difficulty was or why they were told no?
I don't know why they were told no, but they applied directly to the Education Authority. And those children would have been entitled to transport. So there was none.
Okay, thank you. And in relation to your autism provision classes, what arrangements were you able to put in place for those children?
So this was something that we were quite concerned about because we were worried about how their impact in terms of their mental health and well-being, and in terms of them trying to come back to school. So we were trying to have a link as much as possible with these children. So they involved weekly phone calls with my dedicated CRC staff, and that seemed to be really good. We didn't do phone calls for anybody else. but the phone was always there in case anybody wanted to contact us. But the weekly phone calls seemed to work quite well. Those children, in our experience, seemed to fare quite well in terms of being able to come back to school and have a normal return, as it were, in my opinion.
Thank you. And I'd just like to ask you then about your experience of delivering remote learning. Now, in your statement, you set out your view that your school wasn't really prepared for teaching remotely. What were the main challenges that Ballynahinch experienced in trying to deliver education to children in their homes?
I think if you differentiate between online learning and online teaching, it was really difficult to teach children during that first lockdown. What the problems that we had were really those families who were able to access technology, those who had the means to be able to buy a computer or have a computer in the house. A lot of parents did not have smartphones, so they weren't even able to do that. Some of our children in rural areas had very slow broadband, if any. We were given 3G SIM cards so they could put it into smartphones and use them as a hotspot. But you can imagine the conversation I've had with some parents once I've delivered those SIM cards to try and explain them what a hotspot is, and then after 5 minutes of a conversation realize they don't have a smartphone and they don't have an access to a hotspot. So, I mean, it was very, very difficult. The other part which I noticed was that if you had children in maybe P6 or P7 in the last couple of years of primary school, the prioritisation for devices was usually given to the children younger first. If they were going towards a transfer test, at that time it wasn't cancelled, they wouldn't have known that, and they were working flat out in that regard. So I think if you were a parent and you only had the one device, it may have been given to the younger children first. And then if you can imagine a parent who's never been a teacher or never had to do this experience before, they've spent an hour with their first primary school child, maybe an hour with their second primary school child. By the time it comes to your high school kid, you're probably quite tired and it's time to make lunch, and you're probably just, there's not as much monitoring, I would say, generally, as you would monitor the primary school children. And children being children, if they're not being watched, they'll probably end up doing something different. One of the challenges then that we had was that we could not do interactive learning with our children. The resources were uploaded to a cloud-based system, and the children were then able to, if they could log on, which was another challenge they had, they were able to download the resources. Most of them did not have printers, so they were writing on paper from the screen. And then there was no way for us to monitor or evaluate how much learning was going on with the children, because there was no way for them to send it back if they didn't have a printer or a scanner. There was nothing you could do interactively in that. We then ended up photocopying resources, which we took from the cloud. We put them in a bundle. I then drove them to houses, left them at their front doorstep, did the usual, make sure you sanitize it, leave it for whatever number of days, But we even tried posting things as well. And it just became unwieldy, and it just was a bit of a disaster, to be honest.
Okay. And in your statement, and I think you've touched on this in that answer, you refer to COVID money being given, and this is a paragraph 21, just to help you. You refer to COVID money being given to your school for ICT for pupils that never happened. You refer to dongles that were wasted, and you said that the process was very confused, rushed and erratic. Can you explain what the difficulties were in relation to that?
So there were times when we were given money and it was to be spent really quickly on well-being. That's the kind of sentence that was given to me. And I'll give you an example. This was for staff well-being, and I was given money to be spent by a certain deadline. And I scratching my head thinking, what do I spend this money on? So I put money into the staff room for the staff. I put some outdoor seating for children. But when I went down to the company, because you couldn't do it online or by phone, I went down to the company and asked for some outdoor seating. And he said, "You're the sixth principal who's been in the last 2 weeks." So we all had the kind of similar idea. How are we going to spend this money fast? Because we didn't want to lose it. And that seemed to be, at that time, the way it was. If you didn't spend the money, it was gone. In terms of technology, I'm not sure if we had asked or we were told, but there was a promise of either iPads, Chromebooks, or laptops. None of them came to the school. I didn't see any. The dongles were the SIM cards which I mentioned. I think I was given 400 of them, 500 of them. I think I used 30. And of those 30, I had no parent come back to me and say that worked well. So it seemed like great intentions at the start. It just wasn't delivered at the end. And I'm not placing blame on anybody in that regard. I think it was just at that moment everybody trying their best to try and get things done for the children. But it just didn't materialise in the final step.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. I'd like to move on just to ask you a bit about the implementation of various measures in your school. In your statement, you describe different challenges around implementing measures such as masks and class bubbles. Could you tell us a bit about the practical challenges you experienced in your school in implementing those?
So whenever we started off the term, it became very apparent that class bubbles were going to be the most effective way. So children were in the same room the whole day, and with wearing masks as well, and the teachers who were teaching them were wearing masks. So if you can imagine a science class, a science teacher would have to bring the equipment down to a room and try his best to do a science experiment in perhaps an English room where there was no facilities. And the teachers, our kids would really depend on seeing people's faces. So when the masks were being worn by the teachers, you wouldn't know if the teachers were smiling, if they were cross, if they were, they wanted to find out more from children. So it was really difficult. One of the bits then we found difficult as well was that some children had exemptions from wearing masks, and we weren't sure how to implement that because it was causing animosity between the other children. And we had to try and explain to the children as best we could why some children were allowed masks and some were not. We were given CO2 monitors for every room, and inevitably they changed colours whenever the CO2 was going too high. So we had to open all the windows as soon as it went red, and then the children were cold, and I got complaints from parents about, why are children freezing? And I tried to explain how the system works. Whenever we had a child go down with COVID, they were all logged and where it happened. And then if there were 3 children in a bubble, I think from memory, we would have to send the whole class home. So there's 26 children being sent home, and we had to close off that room. Now, the Education Authority at the time had told us, when this happens, we'll send in a sanitation team. I had more than 6 classrooms go down, and we never seen a sanitation team once. It just didn't happen. We were promised air purifiers. It didn't happen either. So there was lots of times whenever we said we were going to get resources, but they just didn't appear.
And in your statement, you explain that you stopped the bubbles after September 2021. And you said that you were worried about the impact on children and that the children seemed much happier. Can you just explain what changed after you moved away from?
It was either September or October at that time. The bubbles went down, and it was just because the children looked so miserable being stuck in the same room all day long. And we made a decision, and I think all schools kind of did at the same time, that we noticed a massive difference in terms of how the children were reacting with each other. They were able to go outside properly, and were able to, go into the proper classrooms, and it just seemed much more effective impact on the kids. And the children were much more happier in total.
And just to finish on these measures then, in your statement, and this is paragraph 36 for your reference, you say that there were issues with pupil hygiene and that you had to remind students to wash their hands and so on. And you say that the assumption that children would wash their hands was wrong. Can you tell us a bit more about the extent to which that posed a practical difficulty for you?
So you would think that as an adult, it's automatic that once you use a bathroom, you would wash your hands. It's kind of ingrained in you, that's what you do. But children are being children. They're going to the toilet and then they realise, oh, I want to run outside, I want to play, I want to do this, I want to do that. There's my friend. They get distracted and therefore sometimes the hand washing. So we would have to put up stickers everywhere. Have you washed your hands yet? We would see them come out of the bathroom and you would say, verbally remind them, did you wash your hands? Do you remember? So we had hand sanitizer basically in every single room as well. And it even led to some silly things. I mean, whenever the children were using it, they were moving their hand too quickly, so it would fall on the floor and then children would slip on it. All those little small things were challenges that we had never dealt with before, and we were trying to learn on the hop, as it were.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. And the final topic I'd like to look at with you before we take your reflections is about the enduring impacts of the pandemic on the children and young people in your school. And in your statement, you have highlighted that persistent absence is an ongoing issue for you. Based upon what is happening in your school, what factors do you think are contributing to that persistent absence?
I think when there was lockdown and parents were working from home, it was probably a nice experience for those children who maybe don't enjoy school as much as others, because they were getting lots of attention and they were able to spend time with their family, and it must have been for those children quite nice. For those children who missed their friends or were a bit more social, who enjoyed school, it probably wouldn't have been as much fun for them. So for the children who maybe didn't enjoy school as much, when they tried to return to school, their parents may have still stayed at home because they were working from home. It must have been a bit of a wrench for them to leave home to go to school. And if the parents were in any way anxious in the house about children bringing back, that anxiety must have had an impact on the children themselves, which would have then caused anxiety for the children coming into school. And what we have found shortly after the second lockdown, the amount of children, and this is probably the same for the rest of the country, the amount of children who are missing school because of anxiety-based reasons has increased. We're only starting to see a decrease now. And I think my concern is that COVID had such an impact in terms of their mental well-being that it's going to take them a long time probably to get over that. I think the children who had parents who went back to work straight away, they had less issues, I think, in my opinion.
Okay, and Mr. Marks, you've mentioned anxiety. Are there any physical or mental health conditions in particular which you consider are contributing to that declining attendance?
Not that I'm aware of. No, sorry.
Okay, thank you. Now, you also describe in your statement, and this is at paragraph 48, a change in how pupils are engaging with education in terms of their behaviours. Can you give us a sense of the enduring impacts you've noticed in your school of the pandemic on that behaviour? Okay,
so what we noticed was that children's behaviour had given us more challenge directly after lockdown, and we tried to have some sort of reset of values, and we tried to, what they call, I suppose, a new normal, but we had to reset everything. I think we had to take a whole new look at this, and we had a whole new vision and values in the school, because we knew that this was not normal and this was not going to be an easy reset. And we have an awful big emphasis on respect of each other. So we have found that had worked well. What we also noticed was that some of the parents' behaviour towards our staff has certainly changed, although that has got better now. But I think in times of high stress and anxiety, sometimes it can bring out behaviours in us that we don't normally exhibit. And I feel that, we were kind of in the firing line slightly a couple of times with parents. And I have fantastic supportive parents, but everybody has their breaking point, I guess. So.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Marks, I think you've had an opportunity to consider this in your witness pack, but research has suggested that the time children spend online has considerably increased since the pandemic. And I wondered, is that something you've observed with your pupils?
Yes, and it's a different type of online ingestion, because we would have normally had kids on YouTube quite a lot. And they would have spent a long time on that. But now it's more to do with things like TikTok and Snapchat. We have actually had to introduce a policy in our school last year of removing the mobile phones from the children when they come into school, and they don't get them back until the afternoon. And we have seen an incredible increase in terms of the way they speak to each other and the way they engage with each other has definitely improved. How they're able to hold conversations. We have seen basically online bullying almost decreased to almost zero now from doing it. And it's funny, whenever we give back the phones, they'll switch them on really quickly, look through it, and then realise they've missed very little and put them back in their pockets, which is tremendous. In the old days, we would have seen them at break and lunch, just constantly looking at their screens, not talking to each other, which I always thought was they're missing out in the best part of school. But what parents would tell me is that when they go home, they do spend much more time on their phones, not tablets, not computers, but on their phones.
Thank you. And the last sort of enduring impact I'd like to ask you about relates to the widening attainment gap, and that's something that Her Ladyship has heard some evidence about already. But I'd like to ask you, to what extent has your school received support to address the issue of lost learning, either during the pandemic or since?
So they have given us money for things like Easter School. This year there will be a Halloween revision session, etc. But the uptake of those classes during holidays is low. I actually believe the biggest attainment loss during the 2 lockdowns was due to the fact that online teaching and online learning was lost. And I put that down to the children not being able to access the technology. If I had a perfect world, and with hindsight, every child should have been given a laptop to take home with a 3G dongle stuck inside it. And we would have been well prepared for actual interactive teaching using the proper software, which we hadn't used before. The pupils trained on how to use it, and strict guidelines and guardrails in order to have effective, safe online teaching. We didn't have that, and that was a miss from all of us, including myself.
Thank you, Mr. Marks. I think I just about have time for one more question. In your statement, you've set out what you think might be improved in the event of a future pandemic, and you've just given us an answer in relation to that now. But one of the things that you suggest is that during a pandemic, education should not be a devolved issue. Now, that might be regarded as the nuclear option, but what is it about your experience that has driven you to that conclusion, Mr. Marks?
So, even just to think about the last storm we had, Aylwin, we had a red weather warning in the south of Ireland, but in the north it was only an amber up until the last moment. And I thought it was funny, because does the storm just stop at the border? And it's kind of like that when it comes to maybe a pandemic, and only in a major emergency. Should all children not be treated the same and have the same, we all be given the same guidelines? And that was my only point. And I feel that, the children in London should be the same as children in Glasgow and the children in Belfast. If there was a delay, and the delay caused panic, and it could have made all our lives easier if we had have just all made the same decision at the same time. So that was just a minor bugbear, so I apologise.
Thank you very much, Mr. Marks. My lady, those are all of my questions. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Marks. I mean, I don't think I'm going to accept the challenge of looking into the issues of what areas should be devolved and what not, if you'll forgive me. But thank you very much indeed for all that you and your staff did to try and help the children in your area and for which you're responsible, for whom you're responsible. And thank you very much for the help you've given to the inquiry. I'm very grateful.
Thank you, my lady. Thank you.
Very well. I shall break now and return. And I shall return at 10 to 12. Ms. Dobbin.
My lady, may I please call Miss Kate Davis?
Repeat after me. I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Can I ask you to give your full name to the inquiry, please?
Yes, Kate Davis.
And Miss Davis, I think you ought to have in front of you a witness statement which bears the number INQ 000 587 986.
Yes.
And are you content, subject to a correction we will make in the course of your evidence, that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. Ms Davis, I think it's correct that you have been the Public Policy Director of Ofcom since 2021, is that right?
Yes.
But prior to that, forgive me, there's something that I forgot to say before you give evidence. My lady, forgive me, this is important, and it's right that I say this before Miss Davis proceeds with her evidence, but during the course of it, it's likely that there'll be reference to child harm, death and suicide, and it may be distressing for some people to hear. So it's just to ensure that people are aware of that before the evidence goes any further.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dobbin.
Ms Davis, forgive me for having interrupted the question to you, but I think I was asking you about the role that you had during the pandemic within Ofcom.
Yes, so as you said, I was Public Policy Director from July 2021. Prior to that, I was Strategy and Policy Director at Ofcom through the period of the pandemic, from 2017 through the period of pandemic.
Could you provide an overview as to what the state of regulation was prior to the 1st of November 2020 in terms of the regulation of the children's online lives, essentially?
Yes, absolutely. So Ofcom's remit broadly covers communications, so telecoms, broadcasting, spectrum. And prior to November 2020, the only duty we had in this area was relation to promoting media literacy and researching media literacy, which obviously engages questions of how adults and children are engaging with material online.
But in terms of the overall regulation of children's online lives, does that effectively mean that there was no regulatory regime, so to speak, rather that it fell within criminal law or laws relating to personal data?
Yes, exactly. So prior to the video sharing platform regime coming in November 2020, which we'll come on to, there wasn't anything that you would think of as a regulatory regime beyond the ones you've set out, particularly in relation to data protection.
All right, we'll maybe come back to the implications of that. But as you have mentioned, there was a change in the regulatory framework with the introduction of this regime that was specific to video sharing platforms. Is that correct?
Yes.
And a very basic question, if I may, but can you give an example or describe what type of platforms are video sharing platforms?
Yes, absolutely. So it's a service where you go on and you share videos. So YouTube is the most commonly used example, though I should be clear that the regime in the UK was for a subset of those services. So it was about services based in the UK. So at any given time, that was about 20 services.
So I think, as I understand what you're explaining, when this regime came into force in 2020, it only applied to those services which were based in the UK. Is
Broadly
that broadly
speaking, yes.
speaking?
There's a very technical legal definition, but
Yes. I think we'll try and avoid
Yes.
very technical
Agreed.
definitions. But I think what that means as well is that there were a number of services being provided to children in the United Kingdom that were not regulated. Is the reality of the situation. And I think it's also right that although that legal regime came into place in November 2020, that in fact Ofcom didn't start its regulation activities until 2021. Is that correct?
Yes. So in November 2020, it effectively became law in the UK. But what needed to happen for real regulation to take place was for us to consult and eventually produce final guidance for those services. We consulted reasonably quickly, so 4 months after the law, so in March 2021, and finalised that guidance in October 2021, which really kicked off proper regulation.
So in fact, and we'll come to one of your reports shortly, the period that you started, the first time really this area was regulated then, was from October 21 onwards, and your first regulatory year ran to October 2022.
Yes.
So, I mean, just coming back to realities, does that effectively mean that this lack of a regulatory framework persisted through most of the course of the pandemic for children? I mean, in reality, up to October 2021.
Yes.
And once that regime came into effect, is it too broad to say that it was essentially voluntary in nature?
Yes, I don't think that quite works as a description. So what it was is that it was, for, as I say, a subset of services, but some household names in there, so TikTok, Twitch, Snap, based in the UK under the definitions. And what it required was the consideration of whether those services should put in place appropriate measures, but then, you know, whether or not they're appropriate depended on questions of things like proportionality. But things like a process to assure the age of a user, whether or not they had clear terms and conditions, but the specifics of what they could be required to put in place were set out in legislation.
Yes.
So it was a much more narrow regime than the Online Safety Act, which I'm sure we'll come on to. And there were questions about what could be required of each individual service because of proportionality and various other reasons. But we did enforce through that regime, so it wasn't voluntary.
And was it for them to judge in the first instance what was proportionate?
So it was for them in the first instance to judge whether or not to notify. So were they a relevant service? That's the first threshold, if you like. So that's how the process worked. It was for video sharing platforms to notify to Ofcom that they were a relevant service. And then in the first instance, yes, I think it would be for them to judge what's proportionate, but obviously then we were engaging very closely in testing that. And as I say, setting out very clear guidance on what we expected.
All right. And at the same time that this regime was being introduced, the government was also considering a much broader regime for regulation of online people's online lives in general. Is that correct?
Yes.
And in fact, I think that the government white paper related to the Online Harms Act that came out in 2019. Is that right? So was it always envisaged that this video sharing platform regime would be interim until it was overtaken by this much broader piece of legislation?
Yes, so I believe even in our first year report, which was published in 2022, we set out exactly that fact, which was it was seen as a stepping stone, if you like.
And is the Online Harms White Paper a good snapshot as to the government's judgment of the harms that online use potentially posed to children in and around 2019?
Yes, I believe so. I think that's probably a question for government, but yes,
All
I
right.
believe so.
Well, as the regulator, I suppose then, did its overall assessment of the sorts of harms which existed in 2019 accord with Ofcom's assessment?
Yes, to the extent we were able to make an assessment at that time. So because we didn't have duties, we were conducting relevant research. So the question of harm came up in our research with children. But we were, in 2019, we were not at a position where we had expertise in these specific areas. That was something that came later when we had formal regulatory duties. So I wouldn't say we, in 2019, had the best knowledge of the landscape.
I understand. And I also that what the government judged a risk was a matter for government judgment. I wonder if we could just have a look at the white paper, though, just to get an idea of some of the things that were under consideration at that point in time. So this is INQ 000 606 810, and I think we can see on page 1 that this was April 2019. And if we could go to page 20, please. We can see that there was a specific part of this white paper, and that's at 1.17, that was considering children's online lives and the harms that they might experience. This part, though, introducing some of the more positive aspects of children's ability to be online. Is that correct?
Yes.
And I think if we look, please, at... if we go over the page, please, to the next page. It set out in box 7 what some of the positive impacts potentially were. And again, obviously Ofcom has more experience now and expertise in this field. Is that also an assessment that Ofcom continues to make, that there can be positive aspects to children being able to go online and to be able to engage in the internet and with social media?
Absolutely. And I think certainly during the pandemic, we found that it was quite an important lifeline for children, as well as also obviously carrying some risk. And we have over time, though I couldn't tell you quite what shows up in our very latest research on this question, but we have over time specifically asked a question around whether children think the benefits outweigh the risks of being online, and we've asked that question to parents as well.
And if we could please go to paragraph 1.18. So I think this is really where the government introduced the caveat that despite the overall, that the potential positive benefits, that this harmful content and activity could be particularly damaging for children, correct? And I think if we just go on, please, then to look at some of what was being highlighted at that time, if we could go to box 8, please. So, and I won't ask you to go through each of these, but we have cyberbullying, and then box 9, if we can go to that, please. That would appear to suggest, and it's the second bullet point, that the prevalence of using the internet to view related content has also been found to be higher in children than in adults. Was that the sort of information that Ofcom was thinking about in and around this time as well, when it came to...
So at this time, as I say, the kind of journey for Ofcom, if you like, in building the capabilities around online safety, in particular expertise, in particular harms, for example, we started some thinking, working with the government from around 2018, and obviously worked engaged with the government as they produced this white paper, but really our development of our skills and capabilities really started from 2020 onwards. So at this time, we didn't really engage in a lot of these questions in detail. We had our research that pulled out exposure to certain harms. The research at this point, I believe, had a list of certain things, and it would ask children, obviously captured in a way that didn't cut across ethical considerations when undertaking research with children, so we wouldn't ask children about everything.
Yes.
But what I can say is that our later work, so the two fairly comprehensive documents we've pulled together, which are called Registers of Risk,
Yes.
as part of the Online Safety Act, both on illegal content and on protection of children, they both point to evidence in this area. So the Illegal Harms Register of Risk points to the fact that children are more likely to be exposed to harm in this area, the specific self-harm and suicide harm that you've pulled up. And then the Children's Register of Risk pulls up that older children are the most likely out of children's ages group to be exposed to self-harm and suicide content.
Thank you, and we'll come to that. We'll come
Sorry,
to those. No,
drawing the link.
it's really important, and we'll come to those those risk registers in due course. Sorry, that can come down, but I think just for the moment, and again, just focusing here on the sorts of risks that were around on the internet at this time. If we could go back to that INQ 000606810. And to box 10, please. I think that's probably around page 23. Yes, so again, at that time, this concern about underage sharing of sexual imagery starting to come to light as well.
We were aware of it, but
Yes.
as I say, it falls into that same bucket of we hadn't built a regulatory regime in this space and capabilities in this space.
Yes, and we'll come back and look at how that developed. And then I think that we can see at box 11, parents also concerned then. I think it's on the next page, thank you. This emerging issue about the amount of time that children were spending on screen as well. So if we're looking at the pandemic, potentially important to understand this was an emerging issue prior to the pandemic as well.
Yes. In terms of the views of parents, I believe in our research it shows up most actually during the pandemic. This starts to become an increasing concern
Yes.
around an ability to control their child's screen time.
And perhaps, thank you, I'm grateful, if that could come down and we could just go straight to one of those pieces of research then, and that's INQ 000615279. So I think this is one of the first bits of research that was done. And I think, as I understand it, it's not dated, but it dates back to 2021.
Yes, I think that's right.
And again, is this intended to demonstrate some of the potentially harmful material then that Ofcom started to develop an understanding about? Which was on
Yes, so this was research that we undertook to inform how we would implement a regulatory regime.
And if we go to page 25, please. And if we could just bring up, please, figure 18. So this is, as I understand it, this was information or that you sought to get from children themselves, I think. Is that right?
Yes, so the research was across adults and children, but yes, 13 to 17-year-olds were questioned specifically.
And I think the red arrow is an indication of the sorts of, it says at the side, in fact, that children were more likely to come across this material than those older than them. And did Ofcom have an understanding at this stage as to why children were more likely to come across the very material that was of a nature that you might expect adults would come across more?
I don't think we had a detailed understanding, no, but I'm not entirely sure.
And if we could just please go on to page 45 of this document. And if we look at the final paragraph, I think that this also suggests, and I think this is something that maybe Ofcom developed an understanding of as well, was whether or not, in fact, when people came across, or children came across material on the internet that wasn't appropriate, the likelihood that they would report it in any way. Again, is that something that Ofcom came to develop an understanding about?
Yes, so our research, and it's a different piece of research, forgive me, I've forgotten precisely which piece, but it directly shows that children, actually a fairly large proportion of children were aware of reporting mechanisms, for example, but a very small proportion actually used them when they saw harmful content. So yes, exactly what we're speaking to.
And just going then to another piece of research that helps throw some light on this, if we could go to INQ 000615305. And if we could go to page 7 of that, please. This is, in fact, a piece of work done in 2019 to try and understand what exactly children's access to the internet was. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. So this was within our media literacy duty, so the requirement to research and promote media literacy, and this is captured by that. So in order to do that and to share it with others, we think it's very important to understand what's actually going on and how children are using new services.
And is this also information used so that you can chart how children's usage changes over time as well?
Yes.
So, for example, we can see if we're looking at 3 and 4 year olds, we can see if we read down that what it is Ofcom understands they're doing with the devices that they have access to. And also it allows you to see how it changes between ages as well. Is that correct?
Yes.
And can I... some of the research, for example, we can see that Ofcom asks if children are allowed to take devices to bed with them. Mm-hmm. Is that because it's interested in understanding whether or not children use devices, for example, without their parents being around?
Yes, I think, again, it came from, in 2019, it came from this core duty to promote and research media literacy. And as part of that, so if you're thinking about media literacy skills, which are about, what Ofcom would define as about the ability to use, understand and create media across different contexts, then whether or not a child is able to understand the media they're looking at, whether they're doing it on their own or with somebody else, is relevant to that question.
Yes.
And so that's sort of how we get to it, which I think is a yes to your question, but it's slightly differently positioned.
Thank you. I think it's just because when we look then at how some of this research develops, but perhaps, thank you, that can come down. If we could maybe look at your statement in terms of encapsulating then how the picture changes in time. And I think if we could pick that up, please, at page 16, paragraph 74. So, and if we take 74 as our starting point, Ms Davies, at A you have set out what the research showed between 2015 and 2018 children were doing online, correct?
Yes.
So we can see that they were starting to use YouTube, gaming and other online platforms, correct?
Yes.
And then if we go to B, then you've set out how things changed from the period of 2020 onwards. And here, this is covering the pandemic period, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. So during that time, use of VSPs, for example, was almost universal among children.
Yes. So when you say near universal, do you mean there that, or are you suggesting that the use of these platforms changed, particularly during the period of the pandemic, that they became much more ubiquitous than they had been before then?
What our evidence shows is that more children were using them. Yes.
And can I ask then, is there a particular intersection that the inquiry should consider, that this form of platform became used by more children at a point in time when the regulatory regime hadn't matured?
Can you unpack a bit what you
Yes.
mean by that? Sorry.
I think as I was asking it, I realised that that sounded quite complicated. You've said that children's use of video sharing platforms was nearly universal during this period of the pandemic, so spanning 2020 to 2022. You've already explained that your regulatory role didn't kick in until October 2021. So does that mean there is a considerable period of time during the pandemic when this use was increasing, but there wasn't really a regulatory regime covering it?
Yes.
So, I mean, when we're considering this and not being technical about it, when we're looking at what children were able to access on the internet during this period until Ofcom's regulatory role kicked in, are we really looking at a regulatory wilderness during this period?
There was no regulation for safety.
Thank you. If we stay with your statement, and if we please go to paragraph 75. And I think, again, this is probably common sense and straightforward, but I think at 75 you're pointing out that in the period of the pandemic, a difference was that almost all children were going online, and that was a distinction with the period leading up to the pandemic, correct?
Yes, there was an increase, though of course the other important element was that some children were unable to go online effectively for what they needed to do.
And we'll come back to digital exclusion as well, and deal with that. And looking at your paragraph 76, again, you set out that at A, in the period 2015 to 2019, children were diversifying what they were doing online. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then how did that change during the pandemic?
So what we saw during the pandemic was that, as you might expect, the activities centred on socialising. So because they had lost that offline ability to socialise, that was sort of the starting point for how they were talking about online activity, particularly in our qualitative research. But we also see increases in gaming, I believe, and also this concept of multi-screening, so that you'd be chatting to somebody on a laptop, but also looking at social media on your phone at the same time, for example.
And if we go to paragraph 77, you've set out there the changes in what services children were using as well.
Yes.
You've touched on this already, but I think at B, you're drawing attention to specific platforms that became far more popular during the pandemic as well. Is that correct?
Yes, so TikTok in particular became very popular really, really quite quickly.
And are you aware of any reason why that might have been the position during the pandemic?
So what our research showed at this time, it was definitely in the qualitative, but possibly also in the quantitative research, was particularly, and I couldn't tell you why this is, but particularly an interest in short form and ephemeral content, and that particularly picks up on the functionalities of Instagram, TikTok and Snapchat, which we see as very popular during this time.
And when you say ephemeral, do you mean in the sense of fleeting,
Yes.
there quickly?
Yes,
and
so content that appears and then disappears.
And if we look at your paragraph 78, please, this is specifically dealing with exposure to harmful content, correct?
Yes.
And if you could just explain a bit about the period then pre-pandemic and what Ofcom had found about exposure to harmful content.
So pre-pandemic, we undertook research into this area. It was relatively high-level quantitative research, but it still found significant exposure. The question was framed in terms of over the last year, so it's not really telling you anything about the quantity, but significant exposure to a range of harms.
And again, can you, and I think this is the point at which you wish to correct your statement, because in your statement you have specifically said that research found there were similar levels of exposure to different kinds of harm, and I think in fact it's this bit that you want to correct. Is that right?
Yes. So it's actually the subsequent sentence. So with very considerable apologies to the inquiry, there is an inaccuracy. So the figure that is set out there, so the 4 in 5, 12 to 15s, the date is wrong. So it was actually earlier than that. So it's actually a pre-pandemic stat with many apologies, so it doesn't actually help with this. What I would say, so what happened, there's two things that happened with our research during this period which makes kind of trend data quite difficult. One is that obviously due to the pandemic we had to change our research methodologies, so the research prior to this point is generally face-to-face, both qualitative and quantitative, and during the pandemic I had to move to online and also surveys that children would complete either by themselves or with a parent. So that obviously changes the nature of the responses you're getting. At the same time, as we've been talking about, we were preparing first for the video sharing platforms regime and then for the online safety regime. And that meant that we were building up our capability in this area and thinking about different bits of research we wanted to do. So, for example, we launched a new online experiences tracker, I believe in 2021. So all of those things mean we have quite a few data points, but trend data is very difficult. What we do have is data that shows an increase in time spent online in the pandemic. And what our later analysis and evidence shows is that increase in time spent online increases the risk of harm. And I know that comes up from others' evidence as well. The other thing I'd say is we absolutely recognise evidence from a range of other people and bodies that point to increase in harm during the pandemic, and we absolutely don't dispute that.
So just digging into that a little bit more, does it come down to this, that it's the fact that children were online longer and therefore able to explore the internet that exposed them to a greater risk of coming across harmful content?
That is one of the main risk factors, I would say. The other thing that comes out quite strongly from our qualitative research, and it's only 18 children, so I wouldn't overstate it, but I think it provides some kind of helpful texture, is that it wasn't just the amount of time spent online, but the fact that, for example, a number of them either dropped out of online classes or their school day was squeezed in such a way, and because of obviously the requirements on their parents, that it was unstructured time online, that it wasn't just the amount, it was also unstructured, it was usually alone. So there's various other factors, I think. I don't think it's just the amount of time.
It's important to say, Ms Davies, isn't it, that Ofcom did do research during this period that spoke to children. It wasn't based on what their parents said was happening. It was based, for example, on children keeping diaries of what they were doing online that enabled you to gain this greater insight into what they were doing.
Yes, so we have a longitudinal study with a group of children that's been running almost since the start of Ofcom. It's got great insights. It's with 18 children over time, and obviously the children drop out as they turn into adults. And we've evolved our approach to that. So as more people are online, we actually have different ways to engage with the children. And during this period, we used both interviews, which obviously were online, but also diaries, but also asking them to share screenshots of their device usage. So, actually very direct. So not just what the children were reporting themselves, but direct passive measurement of how much time they were spending online.
All right, and I will come back to that, but just staying for a minute on what may have changed during the pandemic. Is there any evidence that because they had more time to explore online, that children were coming across more harmful material than they might have done otherwise? So I'm really asking you a question about the nature of what children may have come across and whether that changed or whether Ofcom knows anything about that.
So what our Register of Risk sets out, which I think is relevant even though it was a later document, is that greater time online increases the risk of harm, very straightforwardly.
Yes, but just to come back to my question, and it may be that there is no answer to this, whether or not Ofcom does know anything about whether or not having that time changes the nature of what children
Oh, okay, sorry, I was misunderstanding your question.
No, I think it was the question. But
I can't bring to mind specific evidence on that.
All right, but it's a simple equation, more time equals greater risk.
Yes.
All right, and again, I just ask you a broad question about this. We'll come in a moment to age verification. But do children come, and were children making this pandemic focused? Were children coming across harmful content regardless of whether a website required an age verification? Or is the problem that children come across harmful material because they're going onto sites or have access to content that they shouldn't have?
I suspect they were coming across harmful content regardless.
All right. And just on and it may be that we don't need to go to this, but certainly research that you did in your first year of regulation, so in that period from October 21 to October 2022, and this was research that was carried out by Yonder, found that a third of children under the age of 18 lied about their age when creating a social media account.
Yes.
Can I ask you, first of all, why does it matter if a child's signing up to a social media account if they say they're 18 when they're not?
Well, there's two things I'd say. So, and I think it's that a third of them had adult ages, which I think is quite important actually, because what you find on social media is both sites and apps that say that their content is for 13 plus.
Yes.
And then you find content that is appropriate for adults, either because the site is specifically for adults or a kind of wider understanding of what's appropriate for adults and what's for children. And if children are saying that they're older than they are, let me put it that way, instead of that they're saying they're adults. If they're saying that they're older than they are, I think two things happen. One, if a site is designed for 13 plus, and we can question whether they are, but if they say that they're for 13 plus, there might be types of content on there that might be okay for an older child to engage with, but might be more harmful to a younger child. But then at the point they sign up, let's say they're 8 and they say they're 13, that's 5 years difference. By the time the site thinks they're 18, they're only 13. So you've also got the point of a child being exposed to adult content. So it's sort of problematic at 2 points, I would say.
And for those children that say they're over 18 when they sign up to a site, if a site is only for people over the age of 18, presumably that's because the sort of content it has is really specifically only for adults, correct?
Yes.
And are those sites more likely to be, is that gaming sites? Are they an example of that?
There may be. I mean, the most obvious reason is obviously that they're a porn service. There will be other sites that decide that they are adult only, particularly with the new online safety regime. They may decide actually we want to have content that's just for adults. But the most obvious reason is that it's a porn site.
All right. And the fact that a third of children say they signed up in your first year of regulation saying that they were older than they were. That suggests that it's not difficult to sign up saying you're either over 13 or over 18. At that point in time, was there much by way of effective regulation on the part of these companies in terms of being able to spot someone's signed up saying they're over the age of 18? We think they're not.
So we set out for companies certainly things that we didn't think were appropriate. So, for example, one of those scrolls where you just fill in a date, especially if it's pre-filled to the date of an 18-year-old, is deeply problematic. Equally, what we said was that a credit card is a suitable way of assuring that somebody is 18, because in this country you have to be 18 to get a credit card, but a debit card you don't have to be 18, so that wouldn't be suitable. And then there are various other things which the technology has developed significantly since the period we're talking about, but everything from facial age estimation through to different forms of analysis you can undertake using an email, where you can work out what's that email been used for. Has it been used for example, taking out insurance? Probably means it's an adult. You can also, companies can also look at sort of meta behaviour of somebody online to work out whether they're more likely to be a child or an adult. There are various things you can do essentially, and there were certainly at this time various things you could do, but the technology has developed.
All right. So there were things that could be done to detect whether or not these were children who were, well, we know there were children who were certainly trying, and it would appear succeeding from your research to get onto sites that were only for adults. Is Ofcom, are you able to assess retrospectively? I understand the point you make that the technology has moved on, but would you have assessed during the period of the pandemic that the technologies had not reached a stage whereby they were stopping children from getting into these sites that required age verification?
So I think we were aware that there were different technologies at kind of different forms of development, but there were certainly ways for companies to have an age gate, if that's an acceptable term, at the point of signing up that could be more effective than you just put in your date of birth.
Yes.
And we had a programme of work, particularly with adult sites, to improve what they were doing in this area with some success.
And does that still mean, though, I'm really just trying to gauge, and again, being realistic and practical about this, and understanding the sorts of risks that children were exposed to during the pandemic, whether in reality there were sites that children were able to register for and stay on,
yes, despite
those regulations.
Yes, and obviously the regulation I'm talking about, we set out that programme from the end of 2021 onwards. So particularly for the period you're talking about, yes, absolutely.
Okay, that's important. So again, this wasn't work in progress during 2021. You couldn't regulate until you had drawn up your guidance. So again, does that mean for the most part of the period we're talking about that the regulation wouldn't really have been there to stop children from getting into these
That's
adult
absolutely
sites?
Fair.
And then just coming back then, and I think the research that Ofcom did during this period sets it all out. But again, I think as you've already alluded to, what this may in large part, but tell me if I'm wrong, it's probably children accessing sexually inappropriate sites if they're doing this.
Able to, yes.
And in terms of just coming back then to the point that you made originally about the research that Ofcom did during particularly during the pandemic, setting aside time, there were then these other factors in the home that also potentially meant that children were more exposed as well. Is that right?
Yes.
And lack of supervision because parents were working or had other things going on in the home as well. Is that one of the other considerations?
Very understandably, yes.
Yes. I think that the Ofcom's research also suggests that parents did know that there was security that they could use on devices to limit what children could have access to, but that perhaps not that many parents at this point in time were making use of those sorts of controls.
Yes, there was an awareness of parental controls, reasonably high, I believe, sort of around 50%, I think. But yes, much lower levels of usage.
And again, and in fact, maybe it would help to go to this so that I can show you it. If we can go, please, to INQ 000 615 274. Thank you. So this was your first year of regulation. And if we could go, please, to page 91. And if we could enlarge the last part, please. And I had wanted to ask you about this second paragraph. So this goes back to self-generated imagery. And then the second paragraph explains the increase in usage, or sorry, the increase in the creation of this imagery as well. Thank you, that can come down. Can I ask again whether or not this was quite a specific pandemic-related issue, and by that I mean, is this a harm in Ofcom's assessment that grew during the period of the pandemic?
So I think we've seen evidence from others that it grew during the pandemic.
That's certainly the NCA's assessment.
And I think there's IWF research into it as well. Sorry, Internet Watch Foundation.
Yes, and I think that the NCA would attribute that to specific pandemic-related issues like boredom, for example. But I just really wanted to understand whether or not that was also an assessment that Ofcom had made, or would Ofcom in this sort of instance, does it rely on the NCA, for example, to come to those sorts of judgments?
So I think what's in our report is that we had noticed an increase. I don't think we get into why that happened.
All right. Another bit of your research from 2020 and 2021. So this is in the this is in the Children and Parents Media Use and Attitude Report. And in it, Ofcom also sets out some research as well about the vulnerability, or what makes children vulnerable as well to coming across online harm. Can you explain a bit about that as well?
Yes, absolutely. So in that report, we added an exploration of vulnerability. We looked at two different dimensions of vulnerability. So one around financial vulnerability and one around vulnerability as a result of being impacted by a long-term health condition or disability. And it is that second form of vulnerability that we found meant children had an increased risk of being exposed to harm.
And I think other research that you've done as well suggests that there are perhaps other children as well who might be more vulnerable to coming across online harm as well. Could you tell the inquiry a bit more about the research
I
in
mean,
that field?
there's quite a few to pick up on some specific examples. So, for example, I think we have research that children with mental health conditions are more at risk of harm, but also specific conditions. So we found some quite specific research that I don't think we should kind of draw too broadly, but about the interaction between eating disorders, children looking for eating disorder content, and then possibly being targeted by CSAM perpetrators and people who want to groom children.
Yes, so they're sort of interlinked vulnerability. Since the pandemic, Ofcom has gone on, as you've already said, to draw up these risk registers. And I wasn't going to take you to them. There's a risk register for 2024 and a risk register for 2025. There is something I'll ask you about, particularly in the 2025 one.
Sorry, can I just explain that the 2024 is specifically on illegal harms and the 2025 is specifically on protection of children?
And is that an innovation in having a report on children in 2025, or did you have one in 2024 as well?
No, it's that they fall out of the online safety regime. So we are required to produce a register of risk. So our own assessment of particular characteristics of children, particular functionalities of services that expose adults and children to risk. And it's, as you will have noticed, a very comprehensive document.
Yes.
So the one in 2024 was specifically related to our illegal harms duties. So it covers things that do specifically impact on children, such as grooming, that are illegal. And then the one in 2025 was a requirement for our protection of children duties.
All right, and I'll come and ask you about the change in the regulatory regime. But those reports, as you say, really comprehensively analyse a whole series of risks to children that emerge from the online world, so to speak. Has Ofcom come to an assessment as to whether or not the pandemic did change or exacerbate children's use of the internet so as to, I suppose, first of all, to change the way they use the internet or change social media?
No, we haven't undertaken an assessment of that in the round.
And has it come to any assessment, or has it done any work to understand whether or not the pandemic itself has changed what children look for online, or anything about, I suppose, children's online lives beyond?
No, I know that it comes up in very specific places. So, for example, the link you were drawing between the pandemic and did that, certainly during that period, that it seems there was an increase in self-generated intimate images.
Yes.
The causality I can't speak to, but we haven't come to a conclusion kind of at that broader level that you're talking about of but the impact of the pandemic as a whole on children's online activities.
Has the amount of time that children spend online, has it changed since 2020?
It has increased, and I think it continues to increase. Quite the impact of the pandemic on that specifically, there were obviously some very practical reasons where we saw a sudden uptick, children having next to no other activities they could undertake. But, yeah, I can't speak to more than that.
So that's as far as the assessment can go. Children's internet use increased during the pandemic. Their social media use increased since the pandemic. And has it stayed at the same sort of levels that we saw in the pandemic, or has it?
So it's overall, it's either the same or going up.
Right. And if we could just go, please, to, this is the final document, INQ 000615307, and it's page 12, paragraph 1.30. So this is from this most recent analysis, and one of the things that sets out is that children most in need of support are likely to encourage this really harmful content. That come down. Thank you. May I just ask, and again, it was really just going back to the pandemic, does that sort of evidence now suggest, for example, that these are algorithms that are targeting children who might go online to look for help because they've got a mental health problem, that then means they are exposed to this sort of content?
So we absolutely identified algorithms as a vector of harm. And in our protection of children's codes, one of the requirements is around there's different forms of content considered harmful to children in the Online Safety Act, but essentially content that is harmful to children not being promoted via those algorithms. So services changing the way their algorithms operated for precisely this sort of reason.
And are we able to say whether during the pandemic that would also have been the position in terms of children being exposed to these sorts of algorithms?
I would assume so. I mean, the technology changes over time, but recommender algorithms were definitely in operation, so I would assume so.
All right. What has changed since the pandemic is the advent of the Online Harms Act, correct?
Yes.
I think the big question then really about all of this is understanding whether or not that act means that the unregulated exposure that children had to these harms during a substantial period of the pandemic, whether or not that act means that they wouldn't be exposed in the same way. Are you able to help us with that?
I'll try.
Or, well, you try and help with that first question.
Yes, absolutely. So, so the Online Safety Act has a few other elements, but let's focus on the two main, which is protecting everybody from illegal harm, and particularly protecting children from certain kinds of content that are judged to be harmful to children. It achieved royal assent in 2023. And the illegal harms elements became enforceable earlier this year in March, and the protection of children's elements became enforceable in July this year. What those elements are all about is services, and by services here I mean user-to-user services, social media, search and pornographic services. But for social media and search, what it is all about is those services having in place systems and processes that are based on a risk assessment undertaken by the service, that they then put in place systems and processes to deal with those risks and keep people safe. So it is not a looking at specific bits of content regime. It is all about what systems and processes. And by systems and processes, I mean things like content moderation, age assurance, some of the things we've been talking about. Why do I mention the timing? I mention the timing because what I can tell you is based on what we know right now, but it is still relatively early days for what is quite a large and comprehensive piece of legislation. What we can already see, I think, is that we've had fairly significant success with particular elements of it. So, for example, the adoption of age assurance, and by this I mean highly effective age assurance. So to the conversation we were having earlier, really services really having in place a robust mechanism for assuring the age of their users. And we've had success both with adult sites, porn services, but also more broadly across the industry where it may be important for them to ensure that they are protecting children from certain kinds of content. We've also implemented specific things such as hash matching for CSAM, which is a particular way to identify child sexual abuse and other forms of content, which would significantly, well, should reduce the prevalence of this content online, so the ability of a child to come across it by mistake. So we can see that things are happening. We are in the process of monitoring and evaluating actually how far are we getting. And we'll be able to say more on that later this year and into next year. I think it does fundamentally change the picture, but quite how far we get in terms of things we're talking about, I think remains to be seen.
Is the issue about providers being outside the UK, does the Act remedy that? In other words, do you have a regulatory reach to
Yeah.
overseas providers?
Yes, so it's different to the video sharing platform regime. The requirement, I will forget the legal specifics, but basically if it can be viewed in the UK, yes, the requirement is for services where people in the UK are engaging with the content on that service, essentially.
And just coming back then to the sorts of really specific things that seem to have arisen during the pandemic. So in other words, that suddenly in the course of a national emergency, you have children who are online for a lot more, for a lot longer periods of time. There may be less supervision of them. Is there any specific work that Ofcom is doing to consider these sorts of periods of national emergency and whether a more robust regulatory response or oversight is required?
So I don't think quite specifically to that question, but I think there's a couple of things I can share that are helpful. So, firstly, I think it is important to be very clear that the Online Safety Act does not engage with the question of time spent online. Where it comes up is through the risk that it increases the risk of harm. But there isn't any legislation around time spent online specifically, and I want to be clear on that. When it comes to this question of national emergency, we are currently consulting on an additional requirement that certain providers, high-risk providers in certain circumstances, should be required to have in place crisis response mechanisms. Now, we set out what constitutes a crisis. I'm not sure the pandemic would because of its longevity, but that where those crises are either driven by a proliferation of online content or result in a proliferation of harmful content, that services should have in place specific mechanisms to engage with the nature of the crisis and to report afterwards on how they've dealt with it. We're currently consulting on that. Separately, in our illegal harms codes, and I believe also in our protection of children's codes, what we do set out is that we expect services to be able to respond to external events when they're thinking about things like content moderation. So there should be an ability to flex your capability to responding to external events, which I think is relevant to this question.
Because I think we included in your bundle some of the evidence from the time that the ability of content moderators to do their job during the pandemic actually reduced, certainly in the first instance. I think we'll hear some more evidence about that next week. So is that the specific issue that you're talking about, that there ought to be a way for these companies to be able to ensure that there's moderation during these periods?
Yes. So we don't require specific levels of content moderation. It's different for every company. And also increasingly we're looking also at automated content moderation. So that doesn't necessarily replace human content moderation, but you need to think about these things in the round. But what we do require, as I say, is that companies are able to respond to external events, which I think speaks directly to this point.
Do you think during the or does Ofcom assess during the pandemic that parents really understood the risks that children were being exposed to online?
I don't think our research suggests that parents did fully understand, but I think it is interesting that I think our research points to increased concern among parents, so around how they help their children, how they manage their online. So there was clearly increased concern even if there wasn't a full understanding. I also think generally when we're thinking about this ecosystem, if you like, of course, because of our media literacy duties, we think about the role of parents and children, but it absolutely isn't all on parents to work it out. It's absolutely about what can the services do to improve this situation.
And is that one of the shifts that the Online Harms Act is intended to achieve, that the burden is on the provider to meet certain standards or to provide safeguards rather than the onus being on parents?
Yes, I think that's a fair assessment.
But I'm just coming back to the pandemic. I mean, does Ofcom, did parents, for example, do you think know that there was this absence of regulation? In other words, do you think that parents during that period would have had certain expectations about how, I don't know, for example, pornography that was provided, to think that children couldn't access that?
So I believe our video sharing platforms research shows that parents thought it was the responsibility of the service to protect children, which suggests a mismatch between expectation and what was going on.
And again, understanding that the point of the regulatory regime is to make providers responsible, do you think that in any future pandemic, nonetheless, there is still a role for education and making sure parents have a realistic understanding of the sorts of risks that children might be exposed to and what children might do in order to try and get access to sites that they shouldn't be on?
Yes, I think that's fair. I mean, what we saw actually during the video sharing platform regime, during our research alongside it, was that parents' understanding of the regulation did actually improve significantly over time, and I think that is important. I think the education piece you speak to is very important. Also, what our research shows is just the importance of just open conversations between parents and children about what's going on, as much as an understanding of the regulation per se. Just an open dialogue about experiences is quite important.
I said that I would come back to digital inequality, and I didn't want to lose sight of that, because there are two sides to this coin, aren't there?
Yes.
On the one side is harm, and on the other side is the necessity for children in order to be able to access education or to be able to maintain friendships. Can I ask you about the other side of the coin now? So first of all, did Ofcom's research indicate that there was a digital divide prior to 2020?
Prior to 2020, yes, I believe so, because we have a technology tracker, but I cannot right now bring to mind the specifics, but yes.
I won't put you on the spot about that, but I think there was research that was carried out that indicated that. But I mean, based on your own knowledge and understanding then of what the position would have been like during the pandemic, is it your understanding then that there was this divide between children who didn't have adequate access to devices?
Yes, absolutely. So as I was saying earlier, we introduced this concept of vulnerability. We obviously did have our ongoing technology tracker, but we also did an analysis around financial vulnerability, and it found that the situation with access to devices was much worse with those households that were most financially vulnerable, as you'd expect, with children either having no access to a device or having access to smartphones only, which we started to look into because the nature of engaging both with schoolwork but also with public services is quite limiting on a smartphone only, and also obviously often that was a shared device.
Yes, I was going to say, when we looked initially at children's access to devices in 2019, that may have given the impression actually that most children did have access to devices. Do you know whether or not, does the research tell us whether or not, for example, that the children were referring, for example, to shared devices or not?
I don't know off the top of my head,
right.
Quite possibly.
But nonetheless, Ofcom's satisfied that there is this proportion of children who don't have access to a device or who have to share it, as you say. And again, just in terms of Ofcom's research of the importance of children being able to go online to maintain friendships during the pandemic, overall, what were the findings about that?
So overall, it's interesting. So we did a first qualitative research after the first lockdown, and then we did one after the third lockdown, which was early in 2021. And it shifts a bit between the two, but certainly after the first lockdown, children really the importance of being able to go online for socialising and drawing a link between it and their well-being, much as alongside the risks we've already talked about. And obviously that impacting if children weren't able to do that and being sort of cut off from social networks.
All right. My lady, I think those are all of my questions. Did you have any questions you wanted to ask?
No, thank you very much indeed, Ms. Davies. I don't have any further questions. All I can say is that I fear you're going to have a job for a long time to come if you stay with Ofcom and trying to protect children online. Anyway, thank you very much for the help that you've given to the inquiry. I'm very grateful.
Thank you.
Very well, I shall return at 2:00.
I'm grateful.